I'm Larissa Lamrock. I am an OSISS volunteer on the family side. We're really excited for our presentation tonight, and for those that are joining us as presenters, it's work that we are really excited about sharing, and glad that all of you who are jumping on board right now are taking some time to learn more about couple hopes and about impacts of PTSD on relationships and the impact of relationships on PTSD. So we'll just take a few more minutes as people are joining us. So get settled in, get your cup of tea, whatever you have on hand, bowl of popcorn, and we'll get started shortly. I think we have a few more participants we're waiting for, but I just want to take this chance to talk a little bit about couple hopes and a little bit about my first introduction and the work that kind of created and led to Couple Hopes. Polly and I have attended quite a few conferences and workshops where we met Dr. Candace Munson and heard her speak about her work with first responders, military members who are living with trauma, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Munson is internationally known for her work around trauma. And Polly and I were both really excited about Dr. Munson's work, looking at the importance of involving significant others, spouses, couples as part of the recovery process. That seemed something pretty novel to us at the time, that the partners need to be included in this process, because it's not something that impacts just the military member or the first responder living with PTSD, but for sure everyone involved, everyone surrounding, and particularly spouses or members of a couple. So Polly and I were pretty excited to hear about her work, and lo and behold, some years later we heard about Couple Hopes, a fantastic program geared specifically to include both members of a couple, whatever significant other that might be within that dyad. So tonight we're going to get to learn a little bit more about that, and we're pretty excited. Before I hand the floor over to you folks, I'm going to take a minute just to support our troops for providing the funding for these OSISS national workshops. I don't even know what number this is. We've been running quite a few workshops nationally with fantastic attendance, covering so many topics I can't even cover them all. So they wouldn't be happening without the support of Support Our Troops, and we're hoping that we can continue that on as we're moving into this new virtual way of doing business. So a few things that I want to put out there. Tonight's session is being recorded, as you probably saw when you joined, although it is anonymous. So we cannot see any of the participants. You are all muted. We can't see your video. And we want to protect anonymity. But if you do have questions that you want to pose to any of the presenters tonight, please feel free to jump on to the Q&A. We encourage you to use the Q&A because you have an option there to to check the box and stay anonymous. So be aware that if you are using the chat, your identity will be revealed. As I said, feel free to ask your questions on the Q&A and check off anonymous if you want to remain that way. So we're going to pause a couple of times through tonight to answer a couple of questions. We do want to make sure that we hear all of the great information that our presenters want to share with us. So we will touch on one or two questions as we move along through the evening. If we do get a lot of questions, we will get back to you with the answers. What we'll do is share them with our presenters. They will have a look at that and come up with an answer, and we'll make sure to email it out to everyone who participates tonight so that you get the answers to what you're hoping for. We also want to acknowledge that some of the things we talk about, let's face it, living with someone with PTSD and supporting them, or living with a diagnosis on your own, can be pretty challenging. There might be some, holy smokes, intimate things that we're going to be talking about, or sensitive things, that's the word I'm looking for, that we might be talking about tonight. So we are going to share the number for CIFMAP for you. So at any time tonight, if you want to reach out to talk to somebody after the session, maybe something a couple of days down the line, you want to have a conversation with a counselor or clinician, please reach out to CIFMAP. Or the family information line number, and both of those will be listed in the chat for you this evening. So I think that is all of the work that I need to do. So at this point, I'm going to actually just quickly hand it over to Pollyann Mahar, and then we will get started on the session tonight. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks to all our presenters tonight. I know I'm looking forward to it.
And I'm just going to quickly introduce, we have Rebecca Mason, who's the FPSC for GTA and covering Meaford and Borden right now. We have Lisa Murphy, who's our regional coordinator for Central West. And we have Chad Bridger, who is our peer support coordinator for Kingston. So they're all behind the scenes and their cameras will go off shortly, but I didn't want to forget them. And Larissa for introducing us tonight. So thanks again, everybody. I'm going to introduce Rob Valla. He is a project manager with the Couple Hopes. I keep saying Couples Hope, but it's Couple Hopes program. And so I'm going to let him introduce Dr. Sky Fitzpatrick, and Kat is another project manager as well. So you can take it away, Rob.
Thank you, Polly, for that. And thank you for, hosting us here today, the entire team for doing so. It's very much appreciated and it's great to see everyone in attendance. So as Polly stated, I'm a project manager for Couple Hopes. I work out of a psychology research lab at Ryerson University in Toronto. And I'm additionally a naval reservist. I serve out of HMCS York. I'm an intelligence officer and I've been serving for about 3.5 years. So that's how I've kind of gotten interested in the work that we're doing here. We have Dr. Sky Fitzpatrick, who's joining us here in the lovely blue shirt there that you see on screen. And she is the lab director of a psychology lab in York University that's called the Tulip Lab. She's also an associate professor at York University in the psychology department. And she's also one of the co-creators for Couple Hopes. So she dabbles in a lot of things in regards to psychology, specifically borderline personality disorder and PTSD. So she's very interested in the mix between those two and really just harnessing the power of couples to create more of a healing response, promoting recovery and resilience. So that's a lot of her great work there. And then we have Kate Martin-Noonan, who is in the bright yellow shirt that you see on screen here. She's also another project manager from the Couple Hopes team. She also works out of the Tulip Lab at York University. And if there is anything that you see on Couple Hopes that you like in terms of our visuals, that's just down to Kate. She has a lovely creative mind there. When we compare it with what's Guy's research mind, that's when we start seeing some of the results we do. So I'm going to end up passing it off to Sky. And again, thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Rob. No, I don't have to introduce myself. That was so lovely. Thanks so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It means a lot to be here with all of you who are in attendance. I wish we were in a room where I could see all your faces, but I will, I see your name, the attendance list. And it also means a lot to be here collaborating with people who are trying to spread awareness of PTSD and improve the lives of people with PTSD and their loved ones. That's so aligned with what we do in Couple Hopes. So thank you so much for having me. I am going to jump right on in with some slides. So before I get started, I want to say, I am here speaking for, in a way, the Couple Hopes team, but I am not like the Couple Hopes team. I mean, you see two wonderful people on the team that are here with me, Rob and Kate. But also I need to acknowledge, of course, the primary developer of Couple Hopes, Candace Monson. And then this list of people is just the beginning of the people who have been involved in creating this intervention and doing this work. I want to acknowledge their work. It takes a village to do this kind of work, and a lot of really generous funders as well. So I want to just start by nodding to that. And then what I'm going to talk about today. So I will, I said I'd say who I am, but I think now you know who I am. So I'll do that really, really quickly. And then I just want to get into it and start to talk about how do we understand PTSD on our end as researchers and clinicians, and how does that interface with relationships? And then we're going to go from there to talking about, well, why would we think about treating PTSD and relationships at the same time? Because that's what we do on the Couple Hopes team. And then I want to talk about the reason we specifically went on to develop Couple Hopes and what that actually is. If you don't know what I mean when I say Couple Hopes, don't worry about it. I will explain that all in good time, and just give you a bit of a sense of what we've been doing. So as Rob said, I'm the director of a lab called the Tulip Lab, and I'm an assistant professor at York University in the Department of Psychology. And I do focus on optimizing treatments for both a disorder called borderline personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's all I'll say about myself, and I'll just get into the stuff that everyone's here for. So what's the link between PTSD and relationships? Why do we talk about these things together? Well, I think the first thing I want to say is, like, PTSD, we know, is one of the few mental disorders or things that, you know, are in the DSM as a diagnosis where we have a bit more of a sense of the cause, right? The cause is often trauma. It's exposure to something traumatic. And that means it's often more common. I probably don't need to say this to this group of people. It's often more common in groups that see a lot of trauma, like first responders, like people in the military, like veterans, and lots of people who are, as part of their job, interfacing with trauma and facing trauma a lot. That means that PTSD might be more common in those groups. So what is PTSD? So some of you probably know, some of you might have like a lived experience of what PTSD feels like, but to actually break it down on how we understand PTSD, I just want to review that quickly and then talk about how that interfaces with our relationships. So there's 4 symptom groups that we think about when we think about PTSD. And we group them into these 4 groups called intrusive symptoms, hyperarousal, avoidance, and then numbing and belief changes. That one can be called a bunch of different things. All of those symptoms impact our relationships, and our relationships impact all of those symptoms. So I want to break that down a little more clearly. So I want to start with the intrusive symptoms. The intrusive symptoms are like the classic PTSD symptoms. They're the symptoms people think about when they think about PTSD. These are symptoms of the trauma intruding on your life. That's why they're called that. So things like nightmares of traumatic events, flashbacks, where all of a sudden it feels like a traumatic event is happening over and over and over again. Memories of trauma coming into somebody's mind when they're just, you know, walking down the street, or when they're bored, or when they're stressed, or feeling really distressed or upset when something reminds somebody of a trauma. Like, all of those get grouped under this symptom group that we call intrusive symptoms. And these symptoms affect our relationships in lots of different ways. So some really kind of simple ways, you know, if people have a lot of nightmares, partners might find that they end up sleeping in separate beds to manage that kind of nightmares. Or they might feel like they have to intervene when a loved one is having a flashback to kind of ground them and say, hey, you're here, that trauma's not happening anymore. Or loved ones might just notice that the person with PTSD seems kind of distracted, or not as available as they used to because they're preoccupied if they're having a memory of trauma. Those intrusive symptoms are pretty unpleasant. People tend to report that those are some of the most distressing symptoms for them. And they lead directly to the next group, which we call hyperarousal. So when people have hyperarousal symptoms, what that means is that their mind or body is like overactivated, it's revving, right? Revving too high. The intrusive symptoms essentially put people in a state of fight or flight. It makes them feel like something dangerous could be happening, and their bodies act as if that's true. So we often see these really intense emotion or body changes when something reminds somebody of a trauma, feeling panicky or heart beating really, really fast. People often report feeling like they have to be on guard more than they used to, like they're constantly scanning for danger, making sure that they feel safe, that it's hard to feel relaxed or like there's not an imminent threat around them. And they often feel more jumpy too. Some other things we see with hyperarousal is that people start to feel more angry than they used to. They might even start to have anger outbursts or feel more irritable. And we just see some other negative emotions too, like emotions just in general increase with the hyperarousal symptoms. And it's probably not that much of a shock or a surprise that these things can affect relationships, right? Of course. So sometimes if people are feeling more angry, there's more negative emotions floating around, conflict is going to be more common, right? If I'm more angry this week, I'm going to be more likely to have conflict with my partner. So that's a pretty typical consequence of these emotions. Sometimes if people feel like they're on guard all the time, or they feel uncomfortable and unsafe the way that they, you know, in public spaces or something like that, they might have the urge to control what they do and what their partner does to make themselves feel more safe. Like be very particular about where they go in public, what restaurants they go to, where they sit, how they sit. And so loved ones might start to feel a little more controlled than they otherwise or maybe used to. And then, of course, when there's more negative emotions, when there's more conflict, when people are jumpy, when people are on guard, it's just hard to feel close, right? It's just hard to feel connected in the same way. And so people start to feel sometimes a little less connected to each other than they did before a trauma. So those symptoms, the intrusive symptoms, the hyperarousal symptoms, are so unpleasant for people that they kind of lead to this next group of symptoms, which are really important to understand, which are the avoidance symptoms. Nobody wants to feel like a trauma is happening to them all over again. Nobody wants to feel that panicky sensation when something reminds them of the trauma. So what do? People tend to start to learn to avoid things that remind them of the trauma and set those feelings off in the first place. So they might avoid certain people that remind them of the trauma. They might avoid certain places. They might avoid thinking about the trauma. And people can avoid in all kinds of ways, right? So it's not just, I don't walk down that street anymore. It can be things like drinking or substance use. It can be overwork, or it can be doing reckless things like driving recklessly, or, even getting into more fights or something like that. Like all of those can be a part of the avoidance symptoms. And one thing I really want to note for the loved ones in the audience is we also see this show up in relationships. It's an idea that we call accommodation. So when I say accommodation, what I mean is loved ones working with or kind of working around avoidance. Loved ones don't want to see the person that they love with PTSD distressed. So they tend to start doing things that help people avoid the things that set off the distress in the first place, like the things that remind them of trauma. Maybe loved ones purposely don't bring it up because they don't want to set their loved one off. Maybe they know that crowds are difficult for the person with PTSD, so they make sure to no longer schedule events where they go to crowds. Maybe the person with PTSD doesn't like driving, so then they drive for them. All of these are ways that loved ones can start to kind of accommodate and work with avoidance. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we think that does to PTSD in the next few slides. The other last group I will say that we see often with PTSD is sometimes called the numbing symptoms. Sometimes people call it something a little more jargony, like changes in cognition and mood and stuff like that. What we essentially see here is almost another form of avoidance. People don't like being in that revved state of hyperarousal. So one of the things that can happen to some people is they start to kind of numb out. It's like they go from a fight or flight response to a freeze response. They kind of hunker down and shut off any negative emotion. But the problem with that is it doesn't just shut off negative emotion, it shuts off positive emotions too. So people stop feeling interested in things that they used to feel interested in, or a sense of pleasure. It's also really hard to feel connected to people because emotions are the way that we connect to each other, right? Emotions are the glue that holds our relationships together. So if we don't feel a lot, if we feel kind of numbed out, our sense of connection to each other starts to change. And of course, that's going to affect our relationships with one another. Another thing that we can start to see is that people with trauma can start to develop negative beliefs or unhelpful beliefs about themselves, about other people, and about the world, about the trauma. So people might blame themselves for the trauma. They might start to develop beliefs about others like nobody is trustworthy or the world is a completely unsafe place. Trauma starts to shape the way they think, even when they are no longer in a dangerous or traumatic environment. All right, so as you see, I talked about all of these symptoms. They all influence each other, right? So the intrusive symptoms, put the body in this sort of fight or flight state sometimes because it feels like a trauma is happening over and over and over again. That leads to that sense of hyperarousal. People try and get away from those symptoms by avoiding and numbing out. And the beliefs that I just talked about actually start to cycle in and play into the intrusive symptoms. And I will talk about why that is in just one moment. So all of these symptoms impact our relationships, and our relationships go back out, impact all these symptoms. It's like this swirling cycle. So we know that PTSD symptoms are actually the typical response that follows experiencing a trauma. So most people after trauma are going to experience PTSD symptoms, but for some people, they kind of go away on their own. And for other people, they don't. And it's for the people that don't have those symptoms go away, those are the people that we say have what we call PTSD. So the question for us becomes, why does PTSD keep going for those people? And we think that there are two things that are playing a role there. beliefs, and avoidance. So if you look at this cycle that I just showed you, it's those bottom two clusters of symptoms that we think are playing a role in this cycle. So why is that? So on the belief side, as I said, trauma starts to shape people's beliefs. Those beliefs can lead to intrusive symptoms. For example, if somebody thought, you know, the world is an unsafe place, if that's what trauma kind of taught them, they developed this belief, they're going to be more likely to feel that fight or flight intrusive symptom reaction that happens with those intrusive symptoms. If they start to think something like, I'm to blame for this trauma happening, they might start to experience shame or guilt or negative emotions that feed into those intrusive and hyperarousal symptoms. They might also start to think, my memory of the trauma is dangerous. Like, things that remind me of the trauma is dangerous, because every time I think about the trauma, I have a panic attack, or I have these really uncomfortable intrusive symptoms. So people start to develop beliefs about what it means to even think about trauma or go there, right? Those beliefs feed into these symptoms, but avoidance helps keep those beliefs alive. So why does avoidance keep those beliefs alive? Well, the reason avoidance keeps those beliefs alive is that if people are, let's say somebody has a belief that, you know, the world is an unsafe place. They come back from a war zone where they were constantly under threat, and they are now here in Canada. They're not under threat in the exact same way, but their mind, their beliefs are telling them that they are. That's going to lead to intrusive symptoms, right? So if somebody avoids going out on the street, talking to people, going to places where there are crowds because it makes them feel unsafe, it's like their system never gets a chance to update. The beliefs never get the chance to kind of self-correct and learn, oh, I may have been in danger back then, but I'm not in danger now, not in the same way. Similarly, if we avoid talking about trauma or thinking about trauma, it doesn't really give us an opportunity to learn in a sense of really experiencing it, that thinking about a trauma or having a memory of a trauma is not as dangerous as the trauma may have been, right? So those beliefs stay alive and these symptoms kind of keep going in a vicious cycle. So there's a couple key takeaways to think about when it comes to our relationships, if that's our understanding of what's keeping PTSD going. So the first is that avoidance can prevent trauma recovery, and accommodation is kind of like an extension of avoidance, can also prevent trauma recovery. That means that our relationships, you know, things that happen in our relationships can play a role in keeping PTSD going, but our relationships also present this amazing opportunity to come together as a team and push back against the effects of PTSD and against the effects of avoidance together, by opening up to each other and talking about it, about talking about how somebody's been impacted by trauma, how they're feeling, and having those conversations. That's pushing back on avoidance as a unit, and that can both help PTSD decrease, recover, and also help relationships get closer and more intimate. So talking about trauma can be a really useful thing for relationships and for the person with PTSD, but how we talk about it can be more or less useful. So typically we say, you know, it's not necessarily important to get into the gritty details of, you know, every single thing that happened in the trauma. That can often be hard for loved ones, it can be hard for the person with PTSD. What's more important is talking about the thoughts that have come from the trauma, the feelings that have come from the trauma, the way people have been impacted by it. Those kinds of conversations can be really powerful. And there's specific ways that loved ones can respond to hearing about that can also help promote trauma recovery or can hinder it. So there's this fascinating body of research that looks at the way loved ones respond when they hear about somebody's trauma experience, and how certain kinds of responses can actually get in the way of that person recovering from trauma and recovering from PTSD symptoms. So I want to give you a bit of a sense of the kind of reactions that we know to be unhelpful when hearing about trauma now, so people have a bit of a picture of that in mind. So one of the first forms of reactions that have been shown to be unhelpful in promoting trauma recovery is treating people differently. So communicating messages like, oh, now that you've experienced this trauma, you're a different person. You can't handle, you know, going to these places anymore, or I'm gonna not be able to talk to you the way that I used to. That tends to make it harder for people to recover. Of course, Victim blame, blaming somebody for their trauma, blaming somebody for what happened during the trauma. It's probably obvious, but research shows, yes, does obstruct or get in the way of trauma recovery. But another one that I think is maybe a little more subtle is something called distraction. So sometimes when we hear about somebody's trauma, we have the urge to take their mind off it. We say, let's go out tonight so you don't have to think about it, or don't talk about it anymore. Let's talk about something positive instead. That kind of response can get in the way of trauma recovery, because it's important for the person with PTSD to not be avoiding, to be able to feel their feelings about what's happened to them. So distraction can get in the way as well. Egocentric reactions are reactions where the person who's in the supporting role, who is hearing about the trauma, kind of makes it all about them. So they might say something like, oh, you think that's bad? Wait until you hear what happened to me last week, or something like that. Of course, we want this to be a relationship where both people can share and hear each other. But when people are hearing about trauma for the first time, research suggests that doing that, taking the focus off them, can be sometimes unhelpful. And then last, attempting to control the trauma survivor and telling them what they have to do in response to this trauma, how they have to handle it, exactly what they need to do to recover, tends to not be as helpful. It's really important for people to feel empowered to make the choices that they need to make to do what works for them to promote recovery from PTSD. So I have so much more to say, but maybe I'll just pause really quickly and ask, before I get into interventions, are there any questions for me about anything I've said so far?
Sky, we actually have no questions yet. You're just moving along, and I think everybody's taken all the information in.
Great. Okay. So I will keep moving along then. So thank you for letting me know. All right. Okay. So I just talked about, I just downloaded a ton of information on you. I talked about all the different symptom groups, the way that they interact with relationships, the way that avoidance can keep those symptoms going. So why then do we think about treating PTSD in what we call a conjoint format? And by a conjoint format, what I mean is treating PTSD both with the person with PTSD and a loved one in the room at the same time. Well, it should be obvious that hopefully from what I just said, that we really think that relationships play a really big role in keeping PTSD going. And we think that relationships are very impacted by PTSD, keeping PTSD going or helping it recover. So relationships are really, really interconnected with PTSD. So the thinking in developing a conjoint intervention for PTSD was essentially, well, these things are so linked, maybe we can optimize PTSD treatment by also improving relationships at the same time. And maybe we can, get more value for doing a treatment by not just treating PTSD, but enhancing relationship functioning, improving the well-being and mental health of partners, and treating PTSD all in one. It's kind of like a 3-for-1. So our fearless leader, Candace Monson, several years ago now, developed a therapy that was designed to do just that. So it's called Cognitive Behavioral Conjoint Therapy for PTSD, or CBCT for PTSD. And it was designed specifically to both treat PTSD and enhance relationship functioning at the same time. And it's delivered to the person with PTSD and their loved one in the room at the same time. So if they're in a romantic relationship, that would look like a couple therapy, for example. So it works on enhancing communication and relationship functioning. It also works on targeting PTSD by undermining avoidance, the way I've just been talking about, and learning how to share and talk about and think about PTSD and trauma differently to help promote that recovery. So changing some of those beliefs that can keep PTSD going. And fortunately, research has shown us at this point that it is effective in this way. It's effective in reducing PTSD, and it's effective in enhancing how relationships function. And the nice thing that we also see about CBCT is there's broader effects as well. So it's not just that PTSD gets better, relationships tend to function better, but in both the person with PTSD and their loved one's mental health tends to improve. We see, parenting outcomes like parenting skills and stuff improve as well. So there's these broad effects of the treatment. So yay, that's very, very exciting for us. But the problem with not just CBCT, but any in-person therapy is there's a lot of access issues. Probably some people in the audience may have experienced access issues, right? So we know that, these kinds of therapies tend to be in large urban cities where experts who can provide them tend to live. We know that they cost money sometimes if people are going and seeking them out in private practice. We know that sometimes people don't have the time, like, a couple, for example, who has childcare needs don't have the time to go and show up to a therapy session together. And beyond all of that, there's stigma, like people don't necessarily want to seek in-person, face-to-face therapies all the time. And then I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but COVID-19 has been a little bit of a barrier to doing in-person therapy with people, right? We're not really sitting in the same rooms with each other anymore. So there's been some reasons why not just CBCT, but any kind of face-to-face psychotherapy is hard to access, even if it works. So that is where Couple Hopes really comes into the picture. So this is where I kind of got involved in this story, and we started to talk about, and really led by the primary developer of Couple Hopes, who is Candace Munson, really thinking about how can we give people everything we think would be helpful for them that comes from CBCT, but not have all those barriers in the way of them getting it. Like, how can we broaden this out to get it to as many people as possible in ways that people often want to learn about it, which is like in the comfort of their own home. So Couple Hopes was sort of our solution to that. Couple Hopes is an online intervention that's self-help. So instead of relying on a therapist or needing to wait for a therapist or having to be on a wait list to see somebody, that's designed to both treat PTSD and enhance relationship functioning at the same time. It's built with 7 different interactive modules that have engaging video content and interactive exercises for couples. So it gives a lot of the kind of information that I've been talking about, as well as providing people exercises to both, come together, to communicate, to unite, and also to undermine avoidance and start to notice how they might be thinking about PTSD and how it might be impacting their feelings as well. So it's based on our leading PTSD science, and it's based on CBCT for PTSD. What we did in designing it is really thought about what are all the things that we really feel like people absolutely need from this CBCT treatment, and how do we put that into this new format? So that's something that we thought about quite a bit in developing it. And it's really designed to help couples come together and fight PTSD as a team, to join together and undermine avoidance, change those beliefs, just like I was sort of saying, we want to see to kind of help PTSD recover. The last thing I'll say is that even though it is not a therapy, provided by therapists, people who do Couple Hopes do have access to coaches. And what those coaches do is monitor changes in symptoms and relationship satisfaction, and they check in with the couple periodically to make sure that they're getting the most out of the program, that they're doing their homework exercises, that they're getting as much benefit from the program as they possibly can. So our goal was to reduce PTSD and enhance relationship satisfaction at the same time. So what we did is we did that by putting together a few different modules. So in Couple Hopes, we start by providing people with basic information about trauma, the way it leads to PTSD, what PTSD really means, like what I just talked about, and how it impacts relationships. So we kind of flesh out a lot of the things that I said earlier. We then transition into working on improving communication. So we teach couples skills to be able to talk to each other more effectively, both in general and specifically in relation to trauma. And then we teach them skills to start to work together to combat avoidance. I like to think about it like PTSD doesn't want any room to be left in somebody's life for anything other than it. And that's what avoidance does. It narrows people's worlds more and more and more. The number of rules, the list of rules of things that they can't do, of places they can't go, gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it kind of starts to push people out. So what we do in these modules is try and get couples to join together as a team and push back on that and say, no, we're not going to just avoid everything. We're going to start to systematically approach things that PTSD is telling us to avoid in order to promote recovery. And then from there, we also start to teach people how to connect by sharing their feelings that come from trauma in a more helpful way, and making sure that they're hearing what each other are sharing, and also starting to share and understand thoughts that come from trauma with each other. Before I go on, I have a little bit more to say, not a ton, but I see that there is a question in the chat. So maybe I'll just pause and answer that now.
I think that would be great. Sorry, Polly.
No,
yeah.
Go ahead, Larissa.
It's a
Go ahead.
fantastic question, and it lends right into what you've been talking about, Dr. Fitzpatrick, about the importance of sharing. So I'm not sure if you can see it, but
Yeah, I can.
is there a certain point during treatment that you would recommend having a conversation with your partner about the trauma? I can remember a time where I would not react well when thinking of the trauma outside of a therapist's office.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's so. First of all, I think that's an excellent question. I also think that that's the kind of question that you're right. It's a personal question. In a way, it's the kind of thing that, you know, if you're with a therapist, that could be really decided what makes sense for you as an individual along with your therapist. So this is not to replace that, because my thoughts on this are going to be very generic and not tailored to a specific person. But in general, like, as a general rule, like, what we do in CBCT and with Couple Hopes is we try and teach people how to communicate effectively with each other, and at that point open up conversations about trauma as early as possible. We don't want people to feel like certain topics are off limits, or like they can't have certain conversations. And at the same time, we want people to know how to talk to each other, how to have conversations, so that those conversations can go as well as possible. And so that's kind of why we think that bringing partners into treatment can be a really good thing, so that partners can learn, you know, like the things I'm saying, like what makes talking about these things helpful? How can I respond that would be helpful? And then, is there a certain point in an individual treatment? Like I said, I think that's very individually specific, but in general, I would say this: as soon as people feel ready to open up, if they're talking to somebody who feels like a safe person, who is going to respond in a helpful way, so somebody who's not going to respond in like a blaming or a shaming way, the sooner that they feel like they're comfortable and ready to open up, I think the better. We want to push back on avoidance as quickly as possible and in every way that we can as possible. And sometimes that means that people end up feeling negative emotions when they're talking, but our goal is not to like prevent negative emotions. When we share negative emotions with our loved ones, that can actually enhance intimacy and connection too. So yeah, I mean, I think, like, again, something to think about in relation to one's individual therapist, if someone's in individual therapy, around what works for them. But as a general rule, we don't purposely say, no, don't talk about the trauma most of the time. I see there's one more question, so maybe I'll just answer that one too. How do you move forward as a couple when your spouse doesn't share his trauma with you, refuses to share with you as the partner? I think that's a really difficult question. And I think, again, it's so specific to your own life, to your own relationship. So again, can't really provide like specific customized information. I think in general, people need to be able to share on their own terms, right? We don't want to force anyone or coerce anyone to sharing something that they don't feel ready to share about. And my hope by doing webinars and talks like this is to help people understand that talking about trauma can be helpful sometimes, and if it's done in a helpful way. So hopefully, with time and with learning about this, learning about the role of avoidance in PTSD, people naturally open up and start to feel ready to share. And I totally get that that kind of has to be on people's own terms. So that's kind of a tricky situation. Yeah.
Can I just jump in,
Please,
Skye?
Pollyann. Yeah, please.
Just, you know, from my experience with my spouse, you know, he really didn't open up with certain traumas from his deployment till much later in his recovery. And again, there was a lot of avoidance. There was a lot of avoidant behaviors like alcohol, drugs, you know, different things that help numb him. And, you know, slowly, when he started to, you know, do more stuff individually, and then when we started to work on it, like, as you said, a team, we were still in sort of these, I'm going to say, these silos. I had my therapist, he had his therapist. But, you know, when we started to realize that we could work on this together as a team, we definitely have had more success moving forward. And now, I mean, he can just, you know, break out even now, 20 years after the trauma, where, you know, it could be that time of year or a certain smell or a certain whatever, and he can say it, but he's not, it doesn't take him necessarily back there, but it's an acknowledgement, and I can acknowledge it with him. And so again, we're looking at it as a couple. It's not, you know,
Mhm.
his
That's
trauma.
beautiful.
It's something that it's impacted our home, and working on it, like I said, as a team has definitely enhanced. But, you know, if I look back 20 years ago when he was starting with his treatments and stuff, he would not be on board with, you know, some of the things that you're saying that
Right.
that we know now really
Yeah.
helped us as a
Mhm.
thing. So all I can say to participants is, you know, there is always hope there, and people will
Mm.
get to there in their own time and their own journey. Everyone's journey is a little bit different. And so,
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
and so I was just going to say, just that education piece, like just all
Yeah.
of the stuff that you educated at the beginning, just a veteran or a serving member with an operational stress injury, PTSD, understanding how those clusters of symptoms impact the relationship and how the relationship impacts. I mean, that to me, knowledge is power. So, you know, if you
Totally.
take one thing away tonight, it's understanding that, and then planting those seeds and watching them grow.
Thank you for sharing your experience. I think that's really helpful. And I think that is absolutely true that people have their own times. You know, they come to this in their own time, and sometimes people don't feel ready to push back on avoidance, and that doesn't mean that they won't in a month or a year or a couple years. And then the other thing I also want to remind people is that not wanting to talk about trauma is kind of the nature of PTSD, right? PTSD makes people not want to talk about trauma. That's like a symptom of the PTSD. So it's normal when your loved ones say, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to go there. Of course not. It's unpleasant. It's painful. It might lead to intrusive symptoms. Like there's lots of really valid reasons why people don't want to do it. When people are in these therapies, these sort of therapies that we call evidence-based therapies for PTSD, one of the things that we start to do is try and provide some information about the way not talking about trauma might be affecting the PTSD, which is kind of paradoxically, it feels better in the moment, but in the long term, it can keep PTSD going. And helping people to understand that in hopes that they might start to feel more comfortable or willing to open up. And sometimes that takes different routes, right? It might not come from, you know, immediately, or it might come from through learning and thinking about this over time. Okay, so I'm going to keep, I know that there are some questions, and I will save some time for more questions, I promise, and I'm pretty close to the end, so then we can maybe chat a little bit more. I just want to say a couple more things about Couple Hopes. So this is what our website looks like. So as I said, it's really designed for people with PTSD and their loved ones, and it provides a lot of this information in hopes to encourage people to start realizing, oh, wow, avoidance might be taking more of a toll than I thought, for example. So we have what couples get is they both have their own accounts. They are linked to each other. So when one person puts in the homework, it kind of can ping the other person can see it, and vice versa. So people are really building their accounts together. We have an app that we have been working on for some time now that's linked that people can enter homework into, and people can monitor their progress throughout the intervention in our little dashboard. So does it work, right? That's like the $1 million question. We really want to know too. So we finished a case series with just 7 couples. It's very, very, very early days. So you really can't say with absolute certainty, yes, it works, no, it doesn't work at this point. What I do want to say is early data is promising. We're very excited about this. Early data suggests that yes, the person who has PTSD, their PTSD symptoms are decreasing significantly, and that relationship satisfaction, particularly for their loved ones, is increasing significantly. So for us, this is really, really encouraging. This suggests that, you know, this might be a promising way forward. And because it's online, because it doesn't require a person with a PhD to do, you know, a lot of time, which is harder to access for people, that we might be able to expand access to these interventions, you know, further, wider, more broadly than we would have otherwise. So we're very excited about this, and it's totally still preliminary. We're still collecting data. We're still trying to, you know, really answer that question of how is it working, who's it's working for, all those sort of things. Before I transition to questions, I do want people to know we are currently conducting a study of Couple Hopes to further test if it's working, which involves giving people access to Couple Hopes for free. The couples, we're recruiting couples for the study where one member has PTSD symptoms and is a military member, a veteran, a first responder, or a healthcare worker. And like I said, people get access to the intervention for free. In fact, we pay people to do assessments as part of the study, and people don't need a diagnosis of PTSD to sign up. So no pressure. I just want people to be aware that that is available right now, and that people who might be interested in that and learning more in participating or in signing up for the study can go to couplehopes.com to learn more or to sign up. With that, I'm going to stop and maybe turn to answer some questions. So I'm going to open the Q&A. I don't know if anyone has a particular question in mind for me to answer, or if I should just go through the list.
Dr. Fitzpatrick, I think just basically because it's something you touched on earlier, and a couple of things that Polly touched on. One of the questions that I hope you will answer is when the spouse is opening up about their trauma, how deep and how much detail do they provide to their spouse? So, I think it is important to communicate about how the trauma is impacting you, have those types of conversations, but how deeply do you recommend someone talking about their specific trauma with their spouse?
It's an excellent question. So one of the things that we say in Couple Hopes and CBCT for PTSD is that we do think it's helpful to share, especially sharing with people who like I said, are safe people, who you trust to respond to you in a non-judgmental and compassionate way. But we don't normally say that it's necessary to get into like the nitty-gritty details. So like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. That tends not to be as important or helpful for people. And typically what we recommend is sort of broad strokes, enough broad strokes for people to kind of understand what we're talking about here. The most important thing is for loved ones to understand how they've been affected by the trauma. What kinds of thoughts has that caused for the person? What kinds of feelings has that caused? How has it made them feel? How has it made them want to navigate their life? Those are the things that can be really helpful for couples to have communication about most of the time in general.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know that you can see the Q&A, so I don't want to be redundant if you're able to,
Sure.
to look
I
through.
can
So
do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe I'll just let you answer those, but I think that last question was really important. So yeah, I'll let
Yeah.
you carry on.
Yeah. Okay. So I see the first question that says, would a program like Couple Hopes be beneficial for just a spouse? What if the person with PTSD is therapied out? The spouse is really needing to learn positive coping skills, healthy debating. Is it possible for only a spouse to take this information and have a positive impact on the relationship? Thank you for that question. That is an excellent question. That's a question that we on the Couple Hopes team talk about quite often. We don't know. We've never tested Couple Hopes in that way, and we're currently not doing a study that involves just spouses, but it is something that we have thought about and considered. And so I'm sorry, I can't give you a clear answer on that, but I will say that we do think about it, and we have been thinking about on our team, like what is some ways that we can provide this information for spouses only when people feel like, yeah, I get it, therapied out. They've been in services for a long time and maybe they don't want to be part of it, but spouses feel like they need something. So it's on our radar, but I don't have a clear answer yet. Is there something you would suggest two veterans in a relationship, both with PTSD, should attempt? Yeah, so cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy for PTSD has been tested for people when both people in the couple have PTSD. So I don't think that people need to necessarily, if people feel like they can seek that out, they can find a provider who can offer that therapy, that is not necessarily precluded from, people aren't necessarily precluded from getting that therapy if both people have PTSD. And of course, we think the skills that people learn can be probably helpful for both people. I see the question, are there reasons why couples would be rejected from participating in this study? Yeah, so in general, what we do when people reach out and are interested in participating in the study is we do a screen to see if they're eligible to participate. So there are reasons why people would be deemed not eligible. It's really not good or bad. If people aren't eligible, sometimes they're eligible for ineligible for the study for lots of different reasons. Can be a combination of different reasons why we might think that at this stage, Couple Hopes might not be the right fit for them. Sometimes people, there's many reasons. Sometimes people are doing well and it doesn't look like the PTSD symptoms are, the nature of the symptoms are such that we think Couple Hopes could help them. So other times there's other reasons why it might not be a fit for them. So what we would do if people reach out is we will give people some questions to screen and see if we think Couple Hopes is a good fit for them at this moment in this time, and within the kind of parameters of our research study, which sometimes has pretty rigid rules about that. And we will reach out to people and let them know either way.
Can I just interject there? I just want to, just so people know, so because peers that are on here that know me really well, I am one to test out any resources prior to me recommending them to peers and stuff like that. So I did go on Couples Hope and stuff, and my spouse and I were not chosen to go through the program because my spouse was actually doing, like, his PTSD symptoms were not they weren't within the realm that you needed for the study. So which was actually a good thing, right? It's a good thing on our end. However, could we have benefited from the programming? Absolutely. So I think, like I've been hearing you say, is that hopefully once this research is done and, you get more couples that have gone through it and the research is there, that the program will be more readily available to a broader spectrum. Would you say that?
Thank you. That is our hope, right?
Yes.
That is our hope.
Okay.
I mean, like, research studies can be a little rigid.
Yeah.
So some of it is for sometimes we're like, oh, maybe that person's not a fit. And sometimes it's just the rigid rules of the research study. So yes, absolutely. One other thing it just occurred to me that I do want to clarify, because we had such a good, rich discussion about like sharing about trauma. I actually want people to know Couple Hopes doesn't actually require people disclose about their trauma a lot. We want people to talk about how it's impacted them. So that's something that we encourage in Couple Hopes, and like the thoughts and emotions that come up and the way that PTSD has impacted them. But we are not actually encouraging people in Couple Hopes to share like details about trauma or anything like that. So if that makes people feel squeamish or uncomfortable, just to let people know that that's a decision that we made in Couple Hopes, that we think that we want people to open up about PTSD more broadly. So that's just one piece of maybe a correction or just sort of an update for people to know. This sounds a lot like the COPE program offered by Wounded Warrior. Other than being online, do you know how this may differ from COPE? I'm not too familiar with COPE. Somebody else might know or be able to answer that question on the panel, but
I think again, there is quite a few different couples programs out there that are more in-person couples, which is, the COPE program through Wounded Warriors, Praxis, the also Wounded Warriors Equine program. So again, they all sort of have their own little niche. This is a totally different program in that it's based on a certain conjoint therapy, and it's being offered online, and it's a research project. So it is not, I'm going to say it's nothing like the COPE program at this point. So that would just sort of, if hopefully that answers the person's question. Sorry.
Great. No, that's great. I see a question: how much does it cost if you're not a part of the study? It's currently not available for outside of the context of our research studies because it's so early days. So we charge nothing, and it involves being involved in the research study at this point. Does it matter how long the partner with PTSD has been dealing with their trauma? No, it does not. In the context that there are specific guidelines of how long ago a trauma had to happen for PTSD symptoms, but in our context beyond that, which is relatively brief, so past month, that is not something that we are particularly picky about, and that we think changes what Couple Hopes can offer people or not. This study is specific for couples with a spouse with PTSD. Understanding that treatment might be slightly different. Would a spouse with a moral injury be automatically deemed ineligible, or would they be accepted and find this program helpful? That's a great question. Right now, what we are testing is for people who have high PTSD symptoms. So sometimes, you know, people who experience moral injury can have high PTSD symptoms in that way, that yes, that then they might be eligible for our study. If they don't at this point, that's not what we're testing, but you know, that might be something we want to explore in the future. Okay, if the PTSD partner is currently seeing a therapist, would Couple Hopes interfere with treatment? Should he talk to his therapist first before looking at Couple Hopes? I think it's always a great idea for people to be talking to their therapist about what makes sense for them and having that conversation. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and making sure that that the person feels like doing this study would be right for them, that the therapist feels like doing the study would be right for them. I think that sounds like a really great idea. On our end, you know, whether or not people are in therapy is not a problem. But yes, I think people need to make those personal decisions, and making them with a therapist sounds like a very logical choice. Are there therapists in Toronto that offer CBCT for PTSD privately, either in person or virtually? There are. And it actually makes me wonder, and I'm sorry that I don't know all this off the top of my head, but Candace might be able to type into the chat or chime in that there might be a website that has people who can provide CBCT. So
we can because everyone that registered, we can send it out, because you also have a resource sheet, and you'll get a copy. The recording will be available for you for 3 months as well. So in that as well, we can send out any links or websites that would enable you to find a therapist that uses conjoint therapy. Because again, I think it is, you know, in what we speak about with our peers in finding that right therapist and stuff. So if some of this that you're has really you know, tweaked your interest and understanding more about it, and finding a therapist that, you know, maybe the online version is not, you know, or maybe you don't meet the criteria or whatever, it doesn't mean that you can't do the therapy with the therapist, you know, a trained therapist in it as well. So
yeah.
great. Yeah.
So thank you for saying that. And actually one thing, Rob has a thought.
Yeah, I'm just going to chime in here. I'm going to throw into the chat for everyone, if they're curious, the Couples Therapy for PTSD website. So that's the CBCT website. You can check out providers. You could learn a little bit more. And if anything, that's what we really encourage, is just learning more and having more awareness. So I'll pass it back to Sky.
Thanks, Rob. Yes, that was what I was thinking. I just couldn't remember if there was a page on that website. So thank you. So that would be one place to look for providers. Yes, I see one more question there. If a couple is accepted into the research study, will their identifying information be kept confidential? Yes, absolutely. So people will get a very detailed informed consent form that will tell them exactly what we do with their information, and exactly what we won't do with their information, and the limits of confidentiality and all that kind of stuff will be really clearly spelled out for people who are interested in participating in the study, for sure. It's a great question. Okay.
Yeah.
So Polly, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Maybe I'll just say, I don't know if there are any other questions, but maybe I'll pass it back to you if not.
Yeah, sure. That's what I was sorry, I was muting and unmuting and I couldn't really see what I was doing there. So I just want to say thank you, Sky. I mean, you gave us a lot of great information and you did it in an hour. So that's fantastic. You definitely are a pro at this, you know your stuff. And so, you know, really what we wanted to do tonight was to really, you know, give you a snapshot of the Couple Hopes program and sort of the nuts and bolts of what it works with. And then, you know, if you're interested in getting into the study, we'll be sending that information out with the recording so that you can get in touch with them as well. And, you know, again, like I said, knowledge is power, and just, you know, it's trying all different things. And I think the one thing that that this program really highlights is the importance of the couple working together in this road to recovery, instead of working in silos. And, I know I've been, with the OSISS program for 10 years, and I really can't say enough about the partners working together when they're ready to. I think we have one more question here.
Yes. Will there be
oh,
access to trained therapists if needed? So, Couple Hopes was developed by therapists. It is developed so that the coaches who give it is not therapy. So that's like one thing that I just want to be clear about while I have people. Like it's not therapy, as in you're not receiving therapy from a trained therapist. There's a coach who will talk to people, who will help them get the most that they can out of the program, and has some training on how to manage like internally what we would do if people are experiencing some kind of crisis. But that we are not, the coaches in Couple Hopes are not trained therapists and are not necessarily operating as if they are like a crisis prevention service or something like that. So it really is a self-help intervention that has paraprofessional coaches, to people who are not trained necessarily as therapists, helping people work through the program. So that could be a part of people thinking through whether or not the program makes sense for them.
That's great. Does anyone else have any other questions? You can chime them up in the Q&A quickly. It is 7:30. So we are done early, but that's okay, because people can have their evenings back. Any other staff? Larissa, Rebecca, Lisa, Chad, anybody have any?
Oh, of
You'd like
course,
to add?
if you're going to let me talk, I'm going to.
Good.
I just, as long as I've been supporting my spouse with post-traumatic stress disorder, and as long as I've been doing the work of peer support, there is a lot of information that I've learned tonight to take away. So thank you all very much. That was very informative. I do want to encourage people to stick around. Don't jump off yet, because at the close of this session tonight, there is a survey that will pop up. That's we really would appreciate if you would fill that out. It's just a quick 5-question survey. So we're hoping you will help us out with that. So
perfect. Anybody else? Everybody's good. Rob, any parting words before we leave?
Thank you for that, Polly. No parting words. Again, really appreciate you guys and the entire team for supporting us and hosting us here, and appreciate really everyone for taking that time today to be mindful and thoughtful about, continuing to expand your own knowledge and think about ways forward in your life that makes sense. If anything, that's what our team really supports. I know that's what the OSISS team really supports, and it's just fantastic to see the community come together like this. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. And with that, we have three questions. One is just great stuff.
Yes.
And then you can see the other. Oh, there's just one question, really.
Yeah, 2 are cheerleading, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so for the person dealing with severe symptoms, how would a spouse know if an online self-help would be the best route? I think that, I don't have an evidence-based answer for that. Part of what we are going to need to figure out as researchers is who does this work for, and who doesn't it work for, and why? Those are empirical questions that we don't yet have the answers to. I think at this stage, probably talking to partners and figuring out if it feels like something people are willing to try and feel like might be helpful for them. That, I know that's kind of an obvious answer. That's sort of the best answer I have at this point. How long is the study opened for? We are going to be open until it's done, and or for at least the next few months. It starts right now. So we are actively recruiting. People could go to the website today to sign up.
Perfect. Are you looking for, and I know you may or may not be able to answer this question, but are you looking for a certain number of couples, because in regards to the research?
A lot.
Okay.
So I don't think people need to worry about, at this stage, I don't think people need to worry about flooding us. We have a good big team of trained coaches, and the number of people we are looking to let into the study is significant. So
Perfect.
if people are interested, please do go ahead and go to couplehopes.com.
Perfect. And
I see one more there.
yes.
If we were rejected before, can we reapply? Thank you so much for your interest. And I know that it's probably frustrating and disappointing, especially if you feel like, you know, sometimes the reasons people aren't eligible is, again, kind of technical or research-based more than it's real world or based on whether or not we think that we can help them. At this point, our criteria have not changed, though, about who is and isn't eligible. I mean, I guess one thing that is people now, healthcare workers are eligible and were not previously, so that has changed. But otherwise, if people were not eligible before, they are not likely to be eligible at this stage again. Again, we are hoping with more evidence that we can broaden Couple Hopes out in the future. So right now, because it's so new, we're in this kind of narrow phase of testing where we have to kind of keep it pretty tight because we want to, you know, make sure that it works and does what we think it does, which we're optimistic about, but before we can really broaden it out further.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, I want to thank everybody. Thank Sky, Rob, Kate, and I know Dr. Munson is on here as well, so I can't see you, Dr. Munson, but thanks for joining us tonight. And thank the OSISS team behind the scenes, and all of you for coming on. I think you gave us some really fantastic information this evening. I look forward to hopefully working with you all again, because I know some of my peers are going to be like, can they come back and do another workshop or something after this? So fantastic. Again, thank you. You're doing such great work, and it's really, I know that this research is going to be really impactful to veterans and their families. So thank you so much for coming out tonight and sharing your time with us and sharing all this about your project.
Thank you for having us. That means a lot to us. We're excited about this. We love spreading the good word and also just talking about PTSD in general. And thank you so much to everyone for your attention. I really appreciate it.